September 1297. A narrow wooden bridge. On one side, thousands of battle-hardened English warriors, knights in gleaming armor, professional soldiers, the elite fighting force of medieval Europe. On the other side, Scottish farmers clutching spears they barely knew how to use. What happened next wasn't just unexpected, it was impossible. A tactical masterpiece so brilliant that military historians still study it today. This is the story of how two rebel commanders turned a simple river, crossing into England's worst nightmare, and sparked a revolution that would echo through centuries. The year before, 1296, Scotland wasn't just defeated. It was humiliated, crushed, obliterated. King Edward of England, a man whose very nickname sent shivers down spines, the Hammer of the Scots, had done the unthinkable. In just 12 brutal months, he'd ripped apart an entire kingdom that had stood proud and independent for generations. Think about what Scotland had been: its own monarchy, its own nobility, its own fierce identity. Then came Dunar that spring, and everything shattered like glass. Nobles surrendered their swords. Castles opened their gates without a fight. Towns bent the knee. Backslash. But Edward wasn't satisfied with just military victory. No, he wanted to crush Scotland's very soul. He marched into Scone Abbey and seized the Stone of Destiny, the sacred rock upon which every Scottish king had been crowned for centuries. He hauled it back to Westminster like a trophy, as if to say, "Your kingdom, it's mine now. Even your history belongs to me." Then came the Ragman Roll, a document so infamous, it still carries that mocking name today. Every Scottish noble, every knight, every landholder of importance was forced to sign it. An oath of allegiance to Edward. Submission in ink and wax. On parchment, Scotland had ceased to exist. But here's the thing about conquest. You can force people to sign documents, but you can't force them to forget who they are. Edward installed his officials throughout Scotland, and they ruled with an iron fist wrapped in greed. Taxes bled the land dry. English soldiers occupied every major stronghold, treating locals with contempt. And at the center of it, all stood one man whose name became synonymous with hatred. Hugh Cressingham, Edward's treasurer in Scotland. Cressingham was the kind of official that makes people's blood boil. He extracted every coin, every scrap of grain, every ounce of wealth he could squeeze from Scottish soil, supposedly for the crown's wars. But plenty lined his own pockets. Stories spread like wildfire about his cruelty. Peasants starving while he feasted. Villages taxed into ruin to feed his avarice. Daily life became unbearable. Farmers watched English soldiers requisition their harvests to feed occupation armies. Merchants paid crushing tolls at every turn. Priests were watched with suspicion. And if you dared whisper the word rebellion, swift, brutal punishment. Scotland was occupied, but Scotland was never tamed. Resistance started small. An ambush tax collector on a lonely road. Nighttime raids on English garrisons. Small bands of armed Scots laying siege to occupied castles. But resistance needs leaders. And by 1297, two names began to spread across Scotland like wildfire. In the north, Andrew Murray, a young nobleman who'd escaped English captivity after Dunar, raised his banner in the Highlands. With cunning and relentless determination, he rallied clans and fighters, besieging English-held fortresses one by one. Murray understood strategy, logistics, coordination. He was building something real. In the south, a different kind of leader emerged. William Wallace. Wallace wasn't nobility. Born into a minor landowning family, he had nothing to lose and everything to fight for. His name first appeared in English records in May 1297, and it appeared beside one word: murderer. He'd killed the English sheriff of Lanark in broad daylight. An act of open defiance so bold it stunned both sides. To the English, Wallace was a criminal and an outlaw. To the Scots, he was the hero they'd been waiting for. Wallace's band struck like ghosts. English patrols ambushed in forest glens. Supply trains burned before reaching their destinations. Garrisons attacked at night with fire and fury, then vanishing before reinforcements arrived. Wallace understood something crucial. He couldn't beat England in open battle. Not yet. So he fought a shadow war. A war of fear, of attrition, of making every English soldier in Scotland sleep with one eye open. By late summer 1297, Scotland was ablaze with revolt. In the north, Murray tightened his grip on English strongholds. In the south, Wallace's raids turned him into a legend. Then something extraordinary happened. They joined forces. Wallace and Murray met sometime in August or early September, and together they commanded perhaps 6,000 to 8,000 fighters. Not professional soldiers, farmers, craftsmen, younger sons seeking vengeance, men who'd abandoned their plows and tools for spears and fury. And they chose their battlefield carefully. Stirling, the narrow wooden bridge over the River Forth, the key to Scotland control, Stirling controlled the gateway between lands and highlands. Meanwhile, Edward's lieutenants were gathering a massive host. John Dewan, Earl of Surrey, an aging but experienced commander, marched north with 8,000 to 12,000 troops, knights in armor, infantry by the thousands, Welsh archers whose longbow arrows could kill at terrifying distance. Surrey expected the Scots to scatter like frightened rabbits. Hugh Cressingham, the hated treasurer, urged swift and crushing action. They saw this as a nuisance to be swatted down. But Wallace and Murray weren't running. They were waiting with a plan so audacious, so brilliantly simple, it would change everything. They were going to turn that narrow wooden bridge into a killing ground. Dawn broke cold and misty over the River Forth. Fog clung to the water like a shroud, and the narrow bridge stood barely visible in the pale light. On the south bank, the English army stirred to life. Banners unfurled. Armor clanked. Knights mounted their war horses, confident in their overwhelming superiority. On the north bank, hidden behind the rising ground of Abbey Craig, Wallace and Murray kept their men silent and still. Spears planted in earth, breath held, waiting. The English commanders argued. Some urged caution. Find another crossing. Avoid the bottleneck. The Earl of Surrey, weary and unwell, seemed inclined toward patience. But Cressingham would have none of it. Delay was cowardice, he argued. These Scots were nothing but rabble. Why waste time marching upriver when the bridge lay right before them? His arrogance won the day. The English would cross at Stirling Bridge. And so began the procession of doom. The bridge was so narrow that only 2 horsemen could ride abreast. What should have been a thundering charge became instead a slow, vulnerable line of soldiers filing across one by one. On the far bank, the ground narrowed between river and marshland, a natural trap. For hours, Wallace and Murray watched and waited. Every instinct screamed to attack, but they held firm. Too soon and the trap wouldn't close. Too late and they'd be overwhelmed. Timing. Everything depended on timing. Finally, when perhaps 2,000 English troops, knights and infantry had crossed to the north bank, the signal came. With a thunderous roar, the Scots surged from hiding. War horns split the air. Spears bristled like a living wall as Wallace and Murray led their shieldrons. Tight formations of spearmen downhill toward the trapped English. The English knights, suddenly hemmed in by marshland and river, had no room to maneuver, no space for the devastating cavalry charge that had won them countless victories. Instead, they were crushed together, pressed into a death trap of their own making. On the bridge itself, absolute chaos erupted. Soldiers still crossing saw disaster unfolding ahead and tried to turn back. Horses reared and screamed. Men tumbled into the water. The wooden planks grew slick with blood. Those trapped on the north side saw their escape blocked by their own comrades. The Scots showed no mercy. Spears drove into armored knights. Horses toppled shrieking into the river. Infantry were cut down where they stood, and in the carnage, Hugh Cressingham, the hated treasurer who'd mocked the Scots and urged this reckless assault, was cut down in the fighting. By midday, the English vanguard was annihilated. Bodies piled among broken lances and shattered shields. Survivors who tried to flee found the bridge jammed with retreating men. Many leapt into the river only to drown beneath the weight of their armor. England's elite warriors had been destroyed by common spearmen, cunning, and the trap of a narrow bridge. On the south bank, thousands of English soldiers watched in horror as their comrades were slaughtered before their eyes. The Earl of Surrey, indecisive and overwhelmed, wavered. Some captains urged him to commit the rest of the army. Surely sheer numbers would prevail. Others warned that the bridge was too narrow, that sending more men would only add to the butchery. Surrey hesitated, and in that hesitation the battle was lost. On the north bank, Wallace and Murray pressed their advantage with relentless fury. This wasn't just battle. This was vengeance for Dunar, for burned villages, for years of humiliation. Then, the bridge itself began to collapse. Planks snapped. Timbers cracked under the weight of panicking men and horses. Entire sections gave way, plunging dozens into the rushing water below. With their vanguard destroyed and the bridge in ruins, the remaining English army dissolved into panic. Surrey ordered retreat. Knights and foot soldiers abandoned the field, throwing aside weapons and banners in desperate flight. The great English host that had marched north with such arrogance was now a shattered, fleeing mob. When silence finally fell, the battlefield was a corral house. Thousands of English dead littered the north bank, stripped of arms and armor by jubilant Scots. Wallace and Murray, bloodied but victorious, had achieved the impossible. With courage, cunning, and the land itself as their weapon, they destroyed one of England's finest armies. But victory came with sorrow. Andrew Murray, struck in battle, would not survive his wounds. His death within weeks was a grievous loss. His strategic brilliance had been essential to their triumph. Yet the victory at Stirling Bridge sent shockwaves across Britain and beyond. Church bells rang throughout Scotland. Fires blazed on hilltops in celebration. Men flocked to Wallace's banner in their thousands. For the first time, everyone understood England was not invincible. In England, the defeat was humiliation. Surrey barely escaped with his life, his reputation in tatters. Edward I, campaigning in France, would soon receive the shocking news that his conquest of Scotland was unraveling. William Wallace, once an outlaw whispered about in shadows, was now a national hero, the guardian of Scotland, the embodiment of his people's fight for freedom. In the months following Stirling Bridge, Wallace moved swiftly. English garrisons, unnerved by the disaster, abandoned castles throughout Scotland. Wallace's forces swept through the countryside, reclaiming territory that had been lost. Scottish nobles who'd bent the knee to Edward after Dunar now saw which way the wind was blowing. Some openly joined Wallace, others offered cautious support. Here was the extraordinary thing. Wallace wasn't nobility, but he carried the authority of victory, and the people rallied to him with unmatched loyalty. He ate the same food as his soldiers, marched alongside them, endured their hardships. To the common folk, Wallace wasn't a distant lord. He was one of their own, risen from the same soil to fight for the same freedom. By the end of 1297, Wallace had been formally declared guardian of Scotland, ruling in the name of the absent King John Ballol. From outlaw to guardian in less than a year, an extraordinary ascent. Flushed with victory, Wallace went on the offensive. leading raids deep into northern England. These strikes served multiple purposes: weakening English morale, demonstrating Scottish strength, securing supplies, and sending a clear message to Edward. Scotland would not merely resist. Scotland would retaliate. But legends, no matter how bright, can be extinguished. In the summer of 1298, Edward I returned from France with vengeance in his heart and a massive army at his back. This time, the king himself would lead the campaign. Near the town of Falkirk, Wallace faced his greatest test. His strategy of attrition, burning crops, harassing supply lines, had worked. Edward's army was starving and frustrated, beginning to retreat. But Wallace made a fatal miscalculation. He believed he had an opportunity to strike. He gathered his forces and shadowed the English army, seeking to intercept them. Edward, however, learned of Wallace's position and turned his massive host to face him. What followed at Falkirk on July 22, 1298, was disaster. Wallace arrayed his infantry in 4 massive sheltrons, the same formations that had succeeded at Stirling Bridge. But this time there was no narrow bridge to constrain the enemy. This was open ground. Edward's knights charged the sheltrons and were repelled, just as before. But Edward had learned from Stirling. He ordered his Welsh longbowmen forward, and they unleashed a storm of arrows upon the tightly packed Scottish formations. The Scots had almost no defense. Without large shields or proper armor, men fell in droves. The sheltrons began to bleed and break. When Edward's cavalry charged again, the weakened formations couldn't hold. One by one, the Scottish circles were shattered. Once inside, the knights hacked the packed spearmen apart. The battle turned into a rout. Between 5,000 and 7,000 Scots perished that day. Wallace himself escaped, though his reputation as an undefeated leader was shattered. By late 1298, he resigned as Guardian of Scotland. After Falkirk, Wallace became a shadow. He traveled abroad seeking aid from France and the Papal Court, but with little success. By 1303, he was back in Scotland, still refusing to submit, even as most Scottish nobles bent the knee to Edward once more. His defiance kept him a marked man. Bounties were placed on his head. English officials hunted him relentlessly. In August 1305, betrayal came. Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight serving the English crown, captured Wallace near Robston. The motives remained debated: ambition, survival, pressure from Edward, but the result was the same. Wallace was transported to London in chains, paraded through the streets as a spectacle. On August 23, 1305, he was put on trial at Westminster Hall. It was a farce. No defense, no jury, no chance. He was charged with treason, though Wallace famously stated, "I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." His words highlighted the hypocrisy, but the verdict was predetermined. That same day, Wallace was sentenced to one of medieval England's most brutal executions. The English believed his death would end resistance. Instead, it created a martyr. Wallace's refusal to submit and his horrific execution transformed him into an eternal symbol of defiance. His sacrifice kept the flame of resistance alive. Robert the Bruce, who would soon emerge as Scotland's true liberator, inherited that flame. He learned from Wallace's mistakes, and in 1314 at Bannockburn would achieve what Wallace could not, crushing English power in Scotland and securing independence. The betrayal by Menteith added tragic dimension to Wallace's story. To this day, Sir John is remembered with bitterness, while Wallace is revered as a national hero. June 1314, the fields near Stirling, Robert the Bruce, now King of Scotland, faced Edward II of England with an army outnumbered more than 2-1. But Bruce had learned Wallace's lessons. He chose his ground carefully, marshy terrain that would neutralize England's cavalry. He organized his spearmen into disciplined schiltrons. And when the English army attacked, he turned their numbers against them. On June 24th, Bruce's forces didn't just hold. They advanced, pushing the English back into chaos. The Battle of Bannockburn became Scotland's greatest victory, securing independence and validating everything Wallace had fought for. From the narrow wooden bridge at Stirling to the fields of Bannockburn, Scotland's fight for freedom was written in blood, courage, and unbreakable will. William Wallace wasn't a king. He wasn't nobility. He was a man who refused to kneel, who turned a simple bridge into a graveyard for an empire's arrogance, and whose name became synonymous with one word: freedom. 7 centuries later, that word still echoes. Because some legends don't fade, they burn eternal.